cold pressed through the thin walls of a bombed schoolhouse in central Germany. The windows were shattered. Cardboard covered the frames. Snow dusted the floor where boots had tracked it in. A woman sat on a bench with her hands clenched in her lap. She wore a civilian coat taken from a relief pile. It did not fit. Her hair was cut short. Her face was hollow from hunger and weeks of fear. Outside, American trucks idled their engines, hummed low. Inside, a U.S. Army nurse knelt to examine her wrist. The nurse removed her gloves. She took the woman's hand to feel a pulse. The woman did not pull away. She did not speak. Her body went rigid. Her breath stopped for a second. Later, she would explain why. She had not been touched kindly for years. In that moment, the war did not end with gunfire. It paused in silence. Two enemies stood still. One hand held another. The cold remained. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River in January. Allied forces in the west pushed through the Ardennes after the Battle of the Bulge. American units crossed the Rhine in March. Germany's transportation network lay in ruins. Cities were flattened by strategic bombing. Food shortages were severe. Civilian morale had broken. Millions were displaced. Refugees moved west to escape the Soviet advance. Others fled east to avoid Allied bombing. The German state could no longer protect its people. It could barely control its own soldiers. The United States Army entered Germany with strict orders. They were to defeat the Wehrmacht. They were to accept surrender. They were to manage prisoners of war. By May 1945, the U.S. Army held hundreds of thousands of German POWs. Many were soldiers, many were not. Volkssturm units included elderly men and teenage boys. Civil defense workers were swept up during rapid advances. Women who worked in military administration or factories were detained for screening. Civilians were often held temporarily until local authorities could be organized. Camps formed quickly in fields, schools, and factories. Conditions were basic. Shelter was limited. Medical care was overwhelmed. U.S. Army nurses followed the advance. They served in evacuation hospitals and field hospitals. Many were part of the Army Nurse Corps. They treated American wounded first. They also treated enemy wounded when ordered. International law required care for POW. The Geneva Convention set standards. In practice, resources were thin. Nurses worked long hours. They saw starvation. They saw typhus. They saw frostbite and untreated infections. They also saw civilians who had lived under constant fear of the Gestapo and Allied bombs. German women faced a unique collapse. Nazi ideology had demanded loyalty and sacrifice. By 1945, that promise meant nothing. Many women had lost husbands and sons. Many had endured forced labor, evacuation, and abuse. As the front moved, some were captured. Others surrendered voluntarily. They expected punishment. Nazi propaganda had warned them of Allied brutality. Fear shaped every movement. Silence became a shield. The moment of contact between a U.S. nurse and a German woman, POW, took place in this environment. It was not unusual medically. Nurses checked pulses. They assessed dehydration. They cleaned wounds. What was unusual was the reaction. When the nurse held the woman's hand, the woman froze. This response was recorded later during post-war interviews and relief organization reports. It was described as shock. It was not combat shock. It was the shock of human contact without threat. From a human angle, the woman's reaction reflected years of control. The Nazi state governed touch. Public affection was regulated. Private life was monitored. Many women experienced violence from authority figures. Touch often meant inspection, punishment, or loss. By 1945, touch meant danger. A hand reaching out did not signal care. It signaled fear. The woman's body responded before her mind could process the act. Her muscles tightened. Her breathing changed. Her nervous system prepared for harm. When none came, confusion followed. Relief came later. From the nurse's angle, the act was routine. U.S. Army nurses were trained to remain professional. They worked across lines of nationality. Many were young. Some had never left the United States before the war. In Germany, they encountered the enemy face to face. They saw that enemy as wounded, sick, and exhausted. Medical ethics guided their actions. They did not ask political questions. They assessed symptoms. They provided care when possible. Holding a hand to take a pulse was standard. It was efficient. It was taught in training manuals. The nurse likely did not expect a reaction. When it happened, She did not pull away. She completed her task. From a tactical angle, the management of POWs and civilians mattered. Disease could spread quickly in crowded camps. Typhus outbreaks had already occurred in liberated areas. The U.S. Army Medical Department prioritized sanitation and screening. Nurses played a critical role. They identified infections. They separated the sick. They organized vaccinations when available. Compassion was not only moral, it was practical. A calm prisoner was easier to manage. A treated civilian reduced unrest. Small actions had large effects on stability. From a technological angle, the contrast was sharp. The war had reached its most destructive phase. Jet aircraft flew overhead. Heavy bombers had reshaped cities. Tanks and artillery dominated the landscape. Yet care still depended on hands and simple tools. A stethoscope, a thermometer, clean water, bandages. The nurse's bare hand represented a low-tech act in a high-tech war. It required no fuel. It required no orders. It required only presence. In a conflict defined by machines, this mattered. From the enemy perspective, surrender brought uncertainty. German civilians and soldiers had been told the Allies would take revenge. Soviet actions in the East reinforced these fears. Stories spread quickly. When Americans arrived, behavior did not always match expectations. Discipline was enforced. Looting was punished. Medical care was provided. For some Germans, this created cognitive dissonance. Years of propaganda collapsed in days. Trust did not return easily. Each interaction tested old beliefs. The turning point came as Allied forces stabilized occupied zones. In April and May 1945, U.S. units established military government offices. German civilians were registered. POAs were processed. Women were questioned and released when possible. Medical screenings expanded. Relief supplies arrived. The U.S. Army worked with the Red Cross and other organizations. Camps became more organized. Food rations improved. Mortality rates dropped. In this phase, individual moments accumulated. The woman who froze at the nurse's touch later described the experience during a debriefing with aid workers. She explained that kindness had disappeared from her life long before the war ended. Authority had always meant command. Contact had always meant demand. The nurse's hand did not demand anything. It checked a pulse. That distinction mattered. It marked a shift from fear to uncertainty, from uncertainty to recognition. Numbers tell part of the story. By the end of the war, the United States held over 3 million German POWs. Tens of thousands of U.S. nurses served during World War II. Many worked in Europe during the final campaigns. They treated enemy wounded as required by law and conscience. Reports from military hospitals note psychological reactions among prisoners when treated humanely. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns observed and documented. Movement defined the turning point. As front lines stopped moving, life restarted. Roads reopened. Trains ran again. People returned to towns that no longer existed. Medical stations became clinics. Nurses stayed on to assist with occupation duties. The woman eventually left the camp. She returned to civilian life in a destroyed country. The nurse returned home months later. Their paths did not cross again. The moment did not change strategy or end the war. It changed something smaller and more durable. Aftermath came quietly. Germany lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Cities required rebuilding. The moral cost of the war was heavy. For German civilians, defeat brought shame, relief, and confusion. For Allied personnel, victory brought exhaustion and reflection. Medical units documented their work. Reports emphasized the importance of humane treatment. These lessons influenced post-war policy. They shaped occupation practices in Germany and Japan. Losses were counted in numbers and in lives altered. The war displaced over 40 million people in Europe. Disease and starvation killed many after combat ended. Medical care saved others. Nurses often remembered enemy patients as clearly as their own soldiers. They carried these memories into civilian life. Some spoke of them decades later. The woman's account survived because it captured a truth that statistics could not. Fear does not end when fighting stops. It ends when threat is removed and trust begins to form. Strategy also changed. The Allies understood that rebuilding required cooperation. Harsh punishment alone would not stabilize Europe. The occupation focused on demilitarization and reconstruction. Healthcare played a role. Clinics reopened, German medical staff were retrained, international aid flowed. Small acts of care supported larger political goals. They reduced resentment, they encouraged compliance, they helped prevent chaos. The war taught the world many lessons. One was about power, another was about responsibility. The moment between a nurse and a prisoner showed that victory carried obligations. Treatment of the defeated shaped the peace. Kindness did not erase guilt. It did not absolve crimes. It acknowledged humanity in a time when humanity had been denied. The reflection remains grounded. Wars are fought with weapons and plans. They are endured by bodies and minds. When the weapons fall silent, bodies remain. They need care. The U.S. nurse did not make a speech. She did not offer forgiveness. She held a hand to take a pulse. The German woman did not thank her. She froze. In that pause, the world shifted slightly. The lesson endures. Even in total war, human contact matters. It does not rewrite history, it shapes what comes after.